All right. Well, welcome to the third episode of The Wolf of Wyn Street. And joining me today is James Meads. James, a brief introduction from yourself would be awesome, and we'll get straight into it.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Sergei. And I love the name of the podcast, actually. My name's James Meads. My background is as a procurement practitioner. So I spent 16 years in corporate procurement and then spent another couple of years doing freelance consulting after that. So started my career in the UK working for Jaguar Land Rover, initially straight out of university. That's sort of how I got into procurement. Then did a couple of different roles within the automotive industry. One of those roles facilitated me to move to Germany, where I spent the rest of my career. And then after the 2008 financial crisis, I decided I wanted to work in a industry that's a bit more recession-proof than automotive. So in 2010, I went to work for a company that makes toilet paper because, as COVID showed us, everyone needs that in a good crisis. And I moved over to the indirect space then. So looked after a lot of procurement around all of the processes that go in to help run a factory. So facilities, maintenance, spare parts, forklift trucks, did a little bit of warehousing spend as well. And then I moved to a different company in the same space, got to travel a little bit with that, spent 3 months in Lagos, Nigeria, looking at procurement out there in a new plant that we'd set up. And the last job that I had was looking after all of the logistics and warehousing procurement in sub-Saharan Africa. So spent a bit of time in South Africa as well, which was fun. They're great people to work with. Don't have the greatest degrees of urgency down there, but they're a really good bunch of people to work with. So I had a good time doing that. And then really, I just had the itch to want to do my own thing. I had this sort of midlife crisis that I turned 40 and thought, I've spent 40 years living in cold, rainy countries. I'd quite like to live somewhere warmer. And that was really the catalyst to decide to do my own thing. I had a colleague that was about 15 years older than me at the time that was very bitter, hated his job, and was only there because he had his kids to pay through university. And I thought, I don't want to be him in 15 years' time. So that was really the push that made me sort of want to do something different.
Something very different, though. So you've just come in from Bulgaria. You also live in Paraguay. What's the story? These are quite niche places to be in.
They are, yeah. It's when you go down that rabbit hole and look at places of how can you lower your tax bill and get residency in different countries. It's a very exciting world in terms of lots of different opportunities that you can have if you know what you're doing and if you know how to structure it properly. Bulgaria really was. I was living in Germany when I quit my job and I wanted to stay in the EU. And I thought, where can I go to have like lower cost of living while I'm building a runway, sort of starting my own business, and also to lower my tax bill. One of the two things that I wanted to get when I quit my job was how can I reduce the two biggest expenses in my life, which were my mortgage and the government. So Bulgaria was a nice choice to be able to do that, just in terms of, I thought if I needed to fly in to a client on a Monday morning and then back out on a Thursday night, it's easy. It's as easy to fly into London or Amsterdam or Frankfurt from Sofia as it is to commute there from different parts of the UK or Germany. So that was the reason for doing that. And then after COVID, when everything went remote and I sort of pivoted a little bit with what I was doing business wise, that gave me a lot more location and time freedom. And I think just geopolitically, with everything that's going on in the world, the southern part of South America is a pretty nice place to be in terms of it's a long way away from any wars and conflict, and it has energy, water, and food, which are the three things that pretty much you need to be safe and secure.
Very good. So tell me a little bit about your career journey to this point. You've been in procurement 16, 17, 18 years, something like that. How did you get into it? And then tell me about how procurement has evolved during that time when you were there.
Yeah, so I first had my taste of procurement. I did a summer job just before my final year of university, just as a buying assistant in a local company just outside of Birmingham, where I grew up, that refurbished gearboxes for automotive companies. and that I didn't really know what purchasing or procurement was at that time. Most people tend to fall into it as a profession. So then after that, quite enjoyed that as a summer job because it was the first summer job that I wasn't working in some horrible factory doing night shifts or something like that. So it was a nice change to sort of work in an office environment in a slightly more professional setting. And and then I came out of university, didn't really know what I wanted to do. So after doing just a couple of interim jobs, I applied for a few graduate programs, and a Jaguar Land Rover was ultimately where I landed because I got that little bit, I think, of automotive experience through that summer job that I think was a key factor for them. And yeah, that's how I got into it back in 2002. So yeah, I started out buying metal components for the Freelander and Range Rover at the time.
Goodness. And how has it evolved in that time? Procurement has gone on a bit of a journey, right? What's the evolution been like from your perspective?
You can't let suppliers take you to the football or rugby anymore.
Why not?
That's yeah, all of that, the corporate hospitality, process and compliance and ethics and all of that stuff's prevented some of the fun stuff that we used to be able to do back then. But no, I think joking aside, it's a lot more professional as a job, as a role than it was back then. Even then, I would speak to people on my team that was sort of the old guard, and they would say they used to negotiate their annual price increase or price reduction with suppliers over 2 or 3 pints in the pub at lunchtime. That was like the old school purchasing of the 80s that they'd grown up with. So it sort of evolved as well since like the early part of my career into now, a much more controlled and a much more process driven type of profession than back then. It was very much pretty much solely focused on cost savings, whereas now it's a lot broader in scope. You've got, depending on what industry you're in, if you're in public sector or you're in a regulated industry, there's a lot more about social value and ESG that's come in now that wasn't a thing back then. And procurement now, with a lot of, especially for any company that has a supply chain, with a lot of the geopolitics and the tariffs and everything that's happening more broadly in the macro economy, procurement is becoming not just a cost savings function, but it's becoming a risk management and a value orchestrator as well across the business. And I still think it's the early adopters that are seeing the benefit of procurement evolving into that. There's still a lot of old school procurement teams, but that's certainly the direction of travel. It's just, will we be able to get there fast enough for CFOs to continue to have patience with procurement teams that are still, very, very process obsessed? Because I think we're evolving now from being more of a process and control and police function into, and I talk about this a lot, but I think we need to evolve into being a much more entrepreneurial function if procurement's going to survive and thrive over the next 5 to 10 years.
Well, how do we get there then? Because it's a very different mindset to go from being process driven and probably thinking a lot about just how things are done or how things were done for however long. How do you go from that to being more entrepreneurial, to being more, you know, on the front foot, strategic and thinking beyond cost savings? How do you get there as a procurement function?
Yeah, it's people, process, technology, and architecture, and culture, business culture as well. If you fundamentally have a business culture that doesn't value procurement, I think if you're in that type of role, you're always going to struggle if you're the lone voice that's trying to shout and bring your head above the parapet to make that case. I think if you're in a business that fundamentally sees the value of procurement, and they just need a bit more PR and internal comms to be able to convince the rest of the organization of what else they can do beyond just price and compliance, then you stand a much better chance. And then, do you have the right people and capabilities? I think a lot of it is about mindset rather than experience. If your mindset is very much of a government bureaucrat, it's going to be a lot more difficult to change that and act in a more entrepreneurial way. Whereas if you're coming cross-functionally, maybe from a function like sales or marketing, where you do have to think outside the box a lot more, I think those are much more transferable skills. So I certainly think in the future we'll see a lot fewer traditional procurement people coming in and being successful. And I think we'll see people with cross-functional backgrounds coming in that understand the importance of being able to communicate effectively, and gain influence across an organization to be able to implement. Because it's great being able to put together a category strategy, but it can't just sit in PowerPoint or on someone's laptop. You have to go out and implement it. And I think that's perhaps where procurement has historically has struggled a little bit with that influence within the business and being able to articulate effectively what they do. Procurement people historically have not been good marketers, and I think that's going to be essential now to be able to succeed.
Tell me a little bit about your career after you'd quit the corporate life and you set up your own thing. Tell us a little bit about what you've been working on.
So when did I come out? So I came out of corporate at the end of 2018. So I spent most of 2019 doing some freelance consulting for my former employer. They had a project that they wanted me to continue just part time. So I did that while I was building out other things that I wanted to do business wise. And then when that finished, it was only really a couple of months then until COVID hit and we went into lockdown. So that pretty much scuppered the idea that I had that I would go and meet a bunch of people and network at a lot of different procurement events to really build my networks. When I was in corporate, I'd not really spent much time on an effort on growing my personal network. And obviously back then, 2018, 2019, LinkedIn wasn't what it is now. There weren't as many procurement events as there are now. It was a lot less accepted just to reach out to someone and have a virtual coffee on a Zoom or Teams meeting than what seems normal to us now. So I think that's certainly a silver lining that came out of the pandemic, that became much more normal. So once that happened, I needed to pivot a little bit. So I started my podcast in March 2020. I'd always been interested in procurement tech because as a practitioner, sometimes I felt like a very well-paid admin assistant that, I was on a good salary, and I was spending probably between a third and a half of my time on work that could be outsourced to an admin assistant. If I went on Upwork or one of these outsourcing platforms, I probably could have outsourced a good chunk of my job to an admin assistant. So I thought, well, all of this administrative waste, which is on payroll, tech now should be able to and can, obviously now if you do it right, take a lot of that away. Uh, but a lot of the historical legacy procurement tech was not particularly user friendly. It was complex. Suppliers hated using it. Practitioners hated using it. Some of the big legacy source to pay suites that are out there, I won't name them, but you can probably guess for anyone that's listening to this that's familiar with the old tech. And I just took a couple of months, just went down the rabbit hole and researched what was out there. And what I found was a really rich ecosystem of what was over 200 solutions that we found at the time that were out there that just didn't really have much exposure because they probably didn't have 20, 30, 40 grand to throw at a conference booth, or they didn't have the budget to spend on Google or LinkedIn ads or on sponsoring events. But they were there. They were, when I was reaching out to founders and I was interviewing them for my podcast, we were having great conversations about all this new tech that was out there. And that was great. And the podcast started to get a little bit of traction. But I thought for anyone listening to that, that's a very siloed view of one specific piece of software. But then the obvious question is, well, what else is out there and how do we find those other pieces of technology? And you had, Gartner and Spend Matters and all of these research and analyst firms, but unless you're a Fortune 500 company, you probably don't have a budget to go out and buy a subscription to their services. They do a good job, but they're very expensive. They're aimed at, the biggest enterprises out there. So I thought, how can I democratize access to that data? So as the average chief procurement officer, head of procurement in a mid-market business can go out and view and search and find the procurement tech solutions that would be a good fit for him or her, rather than just the few legacy enterprise tech solutions that everybody's heard of because they've got the biggest marketing budget. After I got a bit of money in the bank from doing a bit of interim and freelance work to be able to fund it, we built a directory website. Bear in mind, this was before vibe coding a lot of these no code platforms. We built a directory WordPress website with, I think, 275 solutions on there when we launched it in 2022, called Procurement Software.site, where basically a procurement practitioner could go in there, could go on there completely free, and could search by primary category or by region or by maturity of the solution and find a matching number of procurement tech companies that theoretically matched what they were looking for. Um, and that's ultimately what I've built the business out from after that. Like all business ideas, it doesn't go the way that you perhaps think it will in terms of how you'll monetize an idea, but fundamentally that's the backbone of what we still do.
So at WYN, we work with different sizes of business, right? And different types of procurement team as a result. You have smaller companies or mid-market firms with a couple of hundred people. They might be tech companies or, where people largely sit at their laptops most of the day. They're using a ton of software. Uh, Companies like that might have 0 to 1 people in procurement, right? So very small to non-existent function. Then there are companies like ITV, the New York Times, where there's a few people in procurement and there's a lot of different categories, and obviously the maturity of the procurement function is different. How do you see, when it comes to procurement tech, the different types of tools that a big enterprise procurement team would need versus the smaller to mid-market companies?
The quick answer is there's a lot more complexity in an enterprise organization. If they're managing a supply chain across 5 or 6 different continents, and there are different countries that have various government e-invoicing mandates that they have to that they have to adhere to, their requirement is going to be vastly different to a 100-person startup in London or New York that maybe only has operations in 2 countries, doesn't have a supply chain, doesn't have to manage physical inventory. So what they're looking for naturally is not going to be as complex, and as such, and also the maturity of the function is going to be a lot lower, and the amount of time and resource that they've got to be able to roll that out to their stakeholders is going to be a lot less. So they need something that can get up and running in a much shorter time than a Fortune 500 company with a complex supply chain. So it's really around cost, user experience, and agility would be the quickest answer. I mean, that there's a rabbit hole that we can go down in terms of the whole number of details, different types of primary categories of software that's out there. But fundamentally, if you're a smallish growing business, the biggest question you want to ask of your software provider is, can we see time to value in weeks and months rather than years? Because you're going to be a lot more sensitive to being able to prove the return on investment than a big monolith corporation.
Still, we see a lot of companies do procurement with spreadsheets. They won't have any kind of orchestration or intake or contract management system in place. A lot of it's still done through spreadsheets. Still, then you have incomplete data, you have just wrong data. I've seen renewal dates of contracts being like the 1910s or something, more than 100 years ago. So you get some weird stuff like that.
On parchment.
Oh my God, it's I've seen some strange things. So what's wrong with doing procurement through spreadsheets? What can go wrong?
A spreadsheet is fundamentally prone to human error. So if you've got a spreadsheet that has formulas in it and then someone breaks it, to your point, if you've had clients that have had contract renewal dates that are in the 1910s, that's clearly either someone's entered incorrect data in there or there's a formula that's gone wrong, because anyone and everyone can edit it. So Excel is fundamentally prone to human error. Number two, Excel is siloed, so it's either on a SharePoint site if it's on some sort of shared drive, or or it's just a spreadsheet that's being managed on someone's C drive. So you can't limit, I mean, I suppose you can limit access to Excel in that you can lock down cells, but you can't have different user groups within an Excel or a Google sheet. So the user permissions that you give to different people within the business around what their permission and editing and commenting roles are within that spreadsheet are somewhat limited. So, spreadsheets are fine to get started, but at some point you outgrow them. If you I use spreadsheets in my business, but I mean, if I grew to a 50-person business, then I would need to then bring in software for certain aspects of that. Bookkeeping is probably a most simple example, right? I can manage my books on a spreadsheet as a two-person business, but if I became a 25-person business, I probably wouldn't be able to. So as businesses scale, the mode that they operate in, and the tech and the systems that they use inevitably outgrow what they start with. I mean, there's you've probably heard of Daniel Priestley as a famous entrepreneur business influencer, and he talks about businesses run great when they're sort of 1 to 12 people. And then he says there's a messy middle between sort of 12 and 50 where you're neither a small business or a scale up. And then
That's
once
us right now,
okay, right.
yeah.
And then once you get beyond 50 people, he said then you kind of need to almost become a little bit more corporate in the way that you operate, and you have a layer of management that decisions go through. But in that messy middle, then it's really hard. And I think that speaks to a lot of what you said around our spreadsheet. What's wrong with spreadsheets? Well, they're great up until a point, but then when you outgrow them, you're not quite at a place where you're going to drop 100 grand on a piece of enterprise software, but you need something that's better than Excel or a Google sheet.
So, what do you help your customers and various companies that you might know do? How can you help maybe a smaller procurement team, a more agile procurement team, go beyond spreadsheets, but then not buy the latest enterprise grade procurement tech? How can you help them?
Yeah, there are two ways essentially that we would help them. I mean, normally on an intro call, on a discovery call, I would do a bit of a mini diagnostic and just ask them some very open ended questions around, what are your biggest challenges? What are your biggest bottlenecks? What are your knowledge workers getting sucked into that is essentially an admin or a copy paste task, or that's causing a lot of rework? Because I always say this: if procurement was a factory process, and you saw all of the inefficiency on a factory floor or on a production line, you would have lean consultants crawling all over it, trying to implement what they call Kaizen, the Japanese word in manufacturing for continuous improvement. Because procurement is a white collar office based process, a lot of the waste is invisible. So I would do a diagnostic and say, okay, well, what are your biggest challenges? If you could automate one or two bottlenecks, what would they be? And just try and plant those on the typical sort of 2 by 2 diagram, and then identify what are the quickest wins that have the biggest impact for the lowest cost or the lowest amount of disruption. And that might be something like suggesting one of our no code lightweight apps that we've built that solve a specific problem. So we've got one for contract management, we've got one for purchase request intake, we've got one for savings reporting, and we've got one that we're building for supplier onboarding. So those satisfy very specific needs. If it's something different, we would look at and say, okay, is that something where we can hire an automation specialist to build a simple AI workflow for you? Or is it a more end-to-end problem like procure to pay, where there's a perfectly good piece of procurement software out there that serves the lower end of the market, that's not built a product for big enterprises? So it's a different approach depending on what the problem is.
Just in the last couple of weeks, we're recording this in June 2026, we've seen Vertees buy Vendor, we've seen Omnia partner with Tropic, we've seen Cooper and Tonkian coming together. What's going on in procurement technology from your perspective?
I think a lot of the legacy players are acquiring companies just defensively because they're losing relevance, because they're not AI native companies. So I think especially in the case of Cooper, I think that's a great example. And I think specifically the Tonkean acquisition was a really smart acquisition for Cooper, because Cooper's getting attacked on the one hand by all of the intake and orchestration platforms coming in and taking business away, snapping at their heels. And on the other hand, they've got a lot of cheaper, more agile competitors that are more focused on the mid market and the lower end of the market. So they're losing business to the more modern technology, the Zips and the Omnias of the world in the enterprise space. But then there are also more agile companies that are doing procure to pay, Procuro, Procurify. There's a bunch of them out there that focus on that focus on the mid market. So they're seeing pressure from both angles. So acquiring Tonkean means that they can actually now legitimately claim to have intake and orchestration as part of their product portfolio. I think the key for Cooper is how quickly and how smoothly can they integrate that, and will it be enough, or is it are they just doing it to be able to cling to their market share? I don't know the answer to that. I think only time will tell. But I think it was a smart acquisition, but very much a defensive rather than an offensive acquisition that I think they had to do it to stay relevant. I think if you talk about Tropic partnering with Omnia and Vertex acquiring Vendor, I think different strategies of why they did each of them. Vendor, I think, was just a pure order book play by Vertex, because they've immediately got a much bigger footprint now in the US market, or where that's their home turf. Tropic partnering with Omnia, equally, it gives Tropic a foothold in the European market. Omnia is based in London. It also signals, I think, Tropic's positioning that they were one of the OGs in this space in terms of, so their market intelligence is going to be one of the best in the market, and that's what they play on. So they're going to then partner with Omnia as being a more robust intake and orchestration piece. Tropic has that within their product, but Omnia, obviously, that's what they've built their product around. It's a much stronger product in terms of the end-to-end offering. So I think both of those are smart moves. They're much more aggressive, much more assertive plays in terms of, that's more offensive, that they want to gain market share. Whereas I think Cooper, it's much more, how do we maintain what we've got and prevent churn?
From our perspective, obviously, the main reason that WYN exists as a company is to fix software overspend. And it's a particular category of procurement that now has tons of money flowing through it. Something like 1.4 trillion a year is now spent on software, and it seems to be growing much, much quicker than inflation in most countries. So there are two problems with software transactions as we see them. I just want to say them to you and get your reaction. The first problem is a knowledge problem. So whenever a company is buying software, on the one hand, you've got the seller. They only really need to know that thing that they're selling, right? That's their employer. On the other side, you've got the buyer that usually has to deal with hundreds, if not thousands, of different vendors. And obviously, asking them to know as much about the software vendor that the salesperson is selling, that's a pretty big ask, right? So there's that knowledge problem. And then there's also a time problem where in most orgs that we've seen, procurement just doesn't have the resource to really scrutinize every transaction, whether it's a new procurement or a renewal. And invariably, you look at, Pareto's principle, you look at which vendors are taking up 20% of your, or let's say 80% of your spend, and you focus on them, and then 20% gets unscrutinized, or sometimes it's the other way around. So you obviously, if you had a magic wand as a CPO, you'd probably have every single transaction be properly scrutinized, but that in practice just can't happen. How do you see negotiations in this world, particularly when it comes to mid-market and enterprise companies, and when it comes to software? How do you see those transactions in your experience?
Yeah, I mean, I think you've hit the nail on the head, Sergey. That software fundamentally, I mean, let's take the optimistic scenario that procurement teams had enough resource to to manage all of that spend, and that they had the time to prepare for negotiations properly. You know, and I know that that doesn't happen, but let's just put that to one side and assume that it did. You've still fundamentally got two really tricky problems when you go out and buy software. Number one is market intelligence. When you go out and buy software, typically any procurement professional within a mid-market organization is generally going to be a more generalist type of character. When you get into larger corporates, you will have like dedicated IT category experts. But even then, you know, are you going to have one that's an expert on software? Are you going to have one that's an expert on hardware? Are you going to have one that's an expert on telecoms? Yeah, maybe if you're a if you're a FTSE 100 company, you will, but the average mid-market company isn't going to have that. So you might even have an IT procurement person, but they're not going to be an expert on every facet of software procurement.
There's so much, right? There's thousands of
Yeah,
software
right,
vendors,
right.
and they're
So
all
you've got
different.
yeah, so you've got that problem, and then you've also got the problem in software that unlike something like a raw material. So back when I worked in industry, we had a team of engineers called cost estimators that would go and essentially like reverse engineer what a widget should cost. And now you've got technology that can do that more. If you look at companies like Delinea and Covalize and WTB Dynamics, just to use three examples, they do what we call sort of should costing in like manufacturing procurement. You can't do that with software. It's SaaS is essentially 80% margin,
It's
right?
all
So
made up,
it's all
Yeah.
made up. It's all marketing. So if you're selling a product that has an 80% margin, it's essentially down to leverage or perceived leverage between the buyer and the supplier. And the small guy may not think that he has leverage, but he does if he plays his cards right and is prepared. And in pretty much every negotiation, in everything that you buy, historically, the salesperson has been better equipped than the buyer in terms of the amount of intelligence and the amount of preparation. Just the fact that sales teams have always been better resourced than procurement teams. Sales teams have admin assistants. Sales teams have subscriptions to market intelligence platforms, whereas procurement are just told to manage with spreadsheets and Google.
And they
Quite
get a lot
foolishly,
of commission for doing well. I mean, sales
right?
historically is so incentivized to just do as well as they possibly can. And the more they can get from the customer, the more revenue, the more they'll get paid in commissions, right?
Unless the procurement person that's doing that negotiation is a subject matter expert at dealing with, I don't know, Microsoft, Oracle, SAP, Salesforce, name any big software company, they're going to be relying on either analyst reports, which typically only speak to a few chief procurement officers from huge corporations, which is not necessarily going to be representative of the sector that this particular negotiation is happening in. They might have some generic market intel. They might have used something like Claude or Copilot to try and scrape what they can. They might have some legacy contract data. They might be part of peer-to-peer networks where they informally share data. There's a couple of WhatsApp groups that I'm in where that happens. Um, but they're not going to have someone that's been on the other side of the fence.
What do you think conventional wisdom gets wrong in procurement today?
I think within the organization, I think conventional wisdom gets wrong that they see procurement as being an admin or a box ticking function. And I think perhaps we've been our own worst enemy historically in pushing that, in that we've always marketed ourselves as being a cost savings function. So a stakeholder that doesn't necessarily understand how procurement works perhaps wouldn't understand why procurement gets frustrated when he or she emails them and says, hey, I've got this contract. Can you negotiate 5% off it? By the way, I need to raise a PO on Friday. So I think we've trained the business into thinking of us that way. That's probably the biggest one. I think sales perhaps overestimates how much data and how much preparation procurement actually does for negotiations, because we don't typically have as much data at our fingertips when it comes to negotiations and the ability to prepare. We can do We can do a Porter's five forces model, and we can do a Kraliyuk model, and estimate how much power we have in the negotiation and some of the influencing factors. But the level of intelligence and the level of data that we have around us, I would say probably in 90% of the cases, it's not going to be as good as the salesperson has. You know, even if procurement is buying something that's considered as long tail spend because the value of that transaction is pretty low compared to the overall spend of the organization, and procurement just thinks of it as an afterthought, I can bet you there'll be a salesperson that has that as his or her key account.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, we see that all the time. It's that imbalance in attention and how much, say, the vendor cares about a certain deal or contract versus procurement for whom, they just overlook it, right?
Yeah, and I think that's because the average revenue that a salesperson is typically tasked to generate or win every year is going to be a lot smaller than the average amount of spend that a procurement manager would manage, and or even the average saving that a procurement manager is expected to bring in. So if you're a procurement category manager and you're earning 100K a year, you'll typically be expected to bring in at minimum a million in savings, so 10x what your salary is. I don't see that same ratio in sales.
No, certainly not. And I remember when I used to sell and my co-founder Adrian used to sell, I mean, quotas for salespeople between, say, 500K and a million were really standard, whereas on the other side, you'd have someone managing probably at least 10 million in spend as a as an individual, right? Procurement person. I
Even
mean,
more
what
than
what
that,
what have you seen back when you were in, say, JLR and big companies like that? Do you remember how much you'd be responsible for?
yeah, I mean, it tends to rise based on seniority. Typically, yeah, I managed probably the biggest amount of spend I managed was about 125 million euro.
You personally?
Not all of that directly. So, I mean, I oversaw strategy that sort of country or plant procurement managers would then execute. So I wasn't raising purchase orders for 125 million euro worth of spend, but that was under my remit in terms of defining the category strategy and the general direction that we would then push across the 30 something plants that we had across EMEA. Um, in terms of actively managing, I've managed $25 million of spend that was like actively, I would be responsible for every negotiation in that under that category.
Yeah. I mean, flip that, and there'll be software vendors whose turnover is less than 25 million, and then they're going to have more than one person running that company, right?
And doing the sales, yeah, absolutely, yeah.
So, in your work right now, is there something that you wish people understood on or got on board with much more than they do? Are you facing any uphill battles today?
I think procurement historically has not been a particularly open-minded profession in terms of the mindset of the people that work in it. I think historically procurement has employed and promoted a very technocratic skill set. So procurement has tended to reward risk aversion and strong adherence to process. And that's got us to a certain place. Especially in regulated industries, procurement is seen as being indispensable because of that in some ways. And yes, it's part of the job. We're always going to have to be robust at contract management and supply chain risk and regulatory risk. I think it's pigeonholed us into being that compliance function. I think if people saw procurement as being an orchestrator of value, a chief value officer, if you will, within the organization, because procurement touches so many different parts of the business, and there are very few positions within a business, apart from maybe sales, that touches so many different facets of the business and has to interact with stakeholders from operations, from legal, from marketing, from IT. Um, there are not many organizations in the business there are not many departments within a business that do that.
When it comes to procurement technology and companies that say have a couple of hundred people, they're not yet enterprise grade, right? They don't need any of the enterprise grade procurement technology. Um, what should they be thinking about in the next couple of years, right? We haven't talked about AI in great depth yet. I guess we have to. So when it comes to AI and companies that are not quite at that big enterprise scale, how can they use AI in their procurement tech to help them go in the right direction?
It's a great question, but I think the first thing we need to take a step back. I think fundamentally they need to rethink their organizational architecture. So a lot of big companies, and especially in government, probably even more, it's even more visible. Knowledge work has typically gone through layers of management, and I think that sort of managerial mindset, that you'd have the worker bees and they would have one level of management, and then you'd have another level of management that discusses and sits in meetings all day and then makes recommendations to the board. AI is going to make that architecture a lot flatter because it's going to completely eliminate the need for that. It's going to eliminate the need to have a lot of middle managers. So you're still going to need to have you're still going to need to have team leaders. You're still going to need to have people that manage a team. But I think managers increasingly are going to manage technical and subject matter experts, particularly around AI and how to build and how to deploy and how to manage agents. But it's going to be less about sitting in meetings all day and being a rubber stamp on decisions. So I think fundamentally procurement needs to be reimagined from the ground up. That whereas before, if you were a mid-sized procurement team that had perhaps like maybe 10 category managers, you're probably only going to have two or three in future. You're going to have different roles. So you're going to have definitely procurement business partners. You're probably going to have someone that's more of a content creator or a marketer within your team to be able to celebrate wins and communicate to the business in terms of what procurement can do. You're going to need to have someone that can code and that can manage agents and that can and that can manage the technology and that can be that can be a sort of technology or AI engineer within the business that's able to that can understand procurement that can also build these automations, these workflows, and that can confidently say when a human needs to be in the loop. Because without having the knowledge and the experience of procurement, you can't get a tech guy to do that because they're not going to understand the context and the process. You can have a tech guy understand the guardrails that need to be there and what the capabilities and limitations of a specific piece of technology is. But unless you've got someone that's done frontline procurement or that's been part of a procurement center of excellence that understands the context where that technology is being deployed in, you can't have that tech person deciding when the AI should make a decision versus when the human should make a decision. And you need procurement people to be able to train that model as well. So I think we will see a lot fewer entry level procurement roles. We will see procurement teams becoming a lot flatter. I think perhaps people that had perhaps hit a plateau in their career historically that were good technical procurement managers, but perhaps didn't have what it took to be team leaders because perhaps they didn't have the ability or the will to be like the political operators that you need at a senior level in a corporate environment. I think they will have a lot more opportunity now to be subject matter experts and still being able to grow their career without being stuck at a certain level within that structure, which I think is great for anyone that wants to progress their career but doesn't necessarily want to have people management or line management as part of that. So I think it will open up a lot of potential new roles. I think some people will do well out of it. Other people might struggle to adapt to the new reality. But fundamentally, before they even take on that question of how do we manage and deploy AI, it's a very long answer to the question, but I think they need to rethink what they're doing from the ground up.
So how can procurement attract the best people possible into the profession, right? Many different careers are competing for the same talent, right? These are young people maybe at uni or people doing apprenticeships. that might not know exactly where they want to go in life, which is okay. And, procurement can then compete for top talent, people who are really ambitious, people who want to make a difference. They're open-minded, forward-thinking. How can procurement attract those kinds of people into the profession from a young age?
Yeah, I mean, one of the answers that you always hear to that question is that procurement is not visible as a career within schools and universities, and I definitely think that
I
that's part
remember
of the
that, yeah.
that's part of the problem. And there are very few. There are a couple, but there are very few masters programs that focus on procurement. There's a few more that focus on supply chain. So I think that's definitely part of the problem. It's just the visibility from an early from a careers perspective.
So how can you change that?
I think part of it is going to be around the industry associations being doing more to make procurement more visible as a career. And I do think SIPs are starting to make noises there to be a little bit better at marketing procurement as a career a little bit earlier on. But I think fundamentally the problem is you don't have to study procurement to be successful in procurement. And most of the people that I know that have been really, really great buyers or procurement leads have come from different functions of the business and have been able to learn on the job. And I always think that will be the case. It's a bit like, if you're hiring someone to come into WYN as a software negotiator, nobody goes through university saying I want to negotiate software as a
That's
career.
very niche, yeah, if they
So,
do.
so how do you do that? Well, I think number one is you have to write less boring job descriptions. If you go on any of these job aggregator websites and look at procurement jobs, they're looking for the skills of 2015. And when I read through those jobs, if I ever if I ever look and think, oh, what would it be like to go back into corporate? I go onto something like Indeed and read procurement job descriptions for half an hour, and that little faint idea on my head of would I ever want to go back into procurement is pretty much put back into the jack in the box, because the job descriptions are so uninspiring. They're looking for very technocratic, process driven people, and that's just not what the role is going to be in a few years' time. So I think that's the biggest one. Don't let HR anywhere near the job ad, and just I think we need more inspiring people in leadership.
So what kind of words and adjectives or verbs are you going to put in the job description today to attract the people that you want?
Creativity, autonomy, technology, value would be the four that spring to mind,
Rather than?
rather than SAP, process, RFPs, compliance.
Yeah, there's a lot of that still that you see in those job descriptions. Okay, so talk to procurement leaders who might be watching or listening to this. What do you want them to take away from this episode?
Your team are not necessarily expecting you to be the subject matter expert on tech or AI, but you need to maybe let your guard down a little bit and bring people into your team that are going to be a bit more disruptive and are going to challenge the status quo. And I think bringing people into your team that have these skills, you shouldn't see them as a threat, because if you do, and you're building up those barriers and you're being very defensive about the way that you hire, honestly, I think that's going to be more career damaging than hiring someone that's going to be a bit of a disruptor in your team and asking you some difficult questions.
Do you have any questions for me?
Yeah, I do actually. I think anyone that sells a service into procurement has a tough job, because just to the point of the last question, a head of procurement might see you as a threat. So I'd say, how would you convince a head of procurement that knows that they don't have the capabilities within their team? How do you convince them that what you bring in is adding value and it's not going to make them look it's not going to make them look poor?
It's a great question. I think a lot of it really comes down to how open-minded someone is. If you're really close-minded, I think it almost doesn't really matter what I say because you're probably not even listening.
They're never going to be convinced. Yeah.
Right. But if you have a little bit of open-mindedness, the thing that really makes a difference here is that I never want WYN to really take any credit. I want to be used as a data source, as an extension of someone's team, almost as a procurement assistant at times, right? You really can just use us in that way, and certainly not compete with us in any way, right? Because we all in our lives are using things that other people have made. We use computers, we use software, we talk to people in languages that, we didn't create anything. And I think this idea that we should be alone in our jobs and kind of try and take all the credit for ourselves is not right, because we are designed as humans to interact with others, to be team players, to use tools and things that other people have made to do well in our lives and careers. So I think that's completely normal to use third parties, whether that's data, whether that's software, whether that's consultancy, whatever it is. That's why we have vendors after all, right? Why don't we just make everything ourselves? Well, it's because someone else really focused on something else and they've become pretty good at doing it, right? So I think the world is built on that concept of specialization. And I don't think it should be any different when you're buying services or software as a procurement team. I don't think you should try and do everything yourself.
Yeah, I agree, and I think part of it's just it's knowing when to pick your battles, isn't it? And knowing when you're going to get a better result. You're going to get a better result by bringing an external team in to help you do it.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So if people liked what they heard or watched, where can they find you? How can they see more content from you, James?
The easiest place is just to connect with me on LinkedIn. My name is James Meads. That's Meads. I'm pretty active, and there you'll see all of my links to my newsletter, the apps that we have. I've got a YouTube channel that I put a bit of content on as well. So everything can be found at podcast. Everything can be found there.
Very good. And is there anything today that you wanted to share with our audience that you feel we haven't yet?
No, I think just be open minded if you're a procurement leader, and just accept that you're not going to know everything, and be open minded to talking to subject matter experts and bringing people into your team that might have a different mindset and different view on how procurement should be done, because I can guarantee that will give you more job security and job safety going forward than just seeing everyone external as a threat.
Words of wisdom. James, thank you so much for joining us. And yeah, look, I wish you all the best. I hope people really tune into what you've got to say and the things that you're doing with companies to make their procurement teams better. Thank you for joining the episode, and I hope to see you very soon.
Yeah, pleasure. Thank you.
Awesome.
Cheers.